Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the after lunch plenary session. We have a few speakers here for your edification and enjoyment. We have, for this plenary on Alberta's land use framework, are we on the right path to planning for sustainability? We have Scott Duguid, Acting Executive Director for the Land Use Secretariat, Kim Lalonde, Director of Regional Planning for Alberta Environment and Parks, and Chad Wilms, Director of Land and Environmental Planning for Alberta Environment and Parks. And the facilitator for this plenary session will be Judy May McDonald, Project Management Lead with Alberta Environment and Parks.
Thanks a lot, Mac. It's my pleasure to be here today, and so welcome. And of course, we've got the hardest spot of the day, and that is after lunch. And lunch was fabulous. Thank you so much to all of the people that served us, and the lunch was excellent. And so now we have to lead with the carb load, and everybody wants to fall asleep. You're not going to do that today, are you? No way. We're going to have an exciting afternoon, and we're going to try to have a few more of those connecting conversations through our plenary session this afternoon. Of course, we were very fortunate to have our Minister of Environment and Parks to address us here just recently, and she just brought some wonderful messages from our department, but also overall around the importance of planning and planning for sustainability. So, without further ado, I'd like to just introduce you to what the agenda for today's session is going to look like. So we really have some excellent presenters today. So we're going to start off with Scott Duguid, who's going to bring us a presentation about Alberta's land use planning and continually improving the process. And Scott will delve into that one a little bit more. And then we're going to have Kim Lalonde, who's going to speak to the Cumulative Effects Management System in Alberta. And she's going to speak to some of the components that help make up that Cumulative Effects Management System. And then we'll have Chad Wilms, who our minister did such a wonderful job at introducing the work that has gone on for the Livingston-Porcupine Hills and some of the sub-regional planning that's been going on in that particular area. And believe me, it was not easy. And I think that Chad will speak to some of the challenges that we had, but I think some of the very positive results that have also come out of that. And I think it's going to model the way for a lot of the planning for recreation and land footprint planning in the future. And then we're going to wrap up with a presentation from Scott again. He gets to do double duty today. And so he's going to introduce us to some of the Indigenous planning and involvement within some of our regional planning and other types of planning activities. For those of you who had the chance to sit and listen to Glynis Buffalo and Bill White this morning, they would have, Bill Snow, sorry, that you would have definitely got some ideas about some of the fabulous work that's been going on down in the South Saskatchewan region with their sub-regional planning and the interaction and the involvement and co-creation of what's been going on with the Indigenous engagement there. So Scott can speak to that. And then we're going to have some conversations. A big part of what we want to try to do today is really start to build some awareness. We want to start building on the blocks of information that some of the previous plenary sessions, plus some of the other learning and lunch and learn programs that you've had going on over the last couple of months. Brownlee has done a fabulous job at setting up some conversations in different areas around the province, around regional and land use planning. And so we're hoping to build on and add more detail to that just to help you get a little better grasp on some of the work that's being going on in the bigger planning system that is related to the land use framework. But the more important part of this conversation is really around what role do professional planners should and or will and or need to have in some of this planning system. So this is really about you. It's not about the land use framework. It's not about the planning system and the content that we're going to talk about. It's really about you. And what role do you feel you need to be playing in this very formative planning system in this province? And so we're going to have a format today where we're going to give you some PowerPoint presentations, feed you with some information, and then we're going to bounce it to you guys to have some table conversations. And so with that in mind, there's some pages that we've planted around the room. So they're long, 11 by 17 pages. The questions are on that page. Don't get afraid. Yes, there's a lot of questions there. And we only have so much time. So in the need of trying to gather some information from you, we're going to let you, at your table, take the conversation to where you need to take it. We've planted the questions there. If you can write your answers to those questions, like pick somebody in the room or at your table to capture some of the highlights of your conversation, it's useful information for us. I will be collecting that information after the session, and you can find me anytime to the end of the conference, and the contact information is there. You can email me your information if you like. But this information will help feed both our Government of Alberta planners to better understand where you feel you might have a role in planning and some of the planning processes that we do, but also from the Professional Planning's APPI, or the Alberta Sustainable Planning Initiative, which I'm a part of that initiative. We're trying to get a feel from you as to what role you see yourselves playing in sustainable planning in the province. And so it's going to help us with some information from two different perspectives. So please take it from there and continue to connect with each other on these very important conversations. And so at this point, I would like to turn the presentation deck over to Scott to be able to start his presentation on the land use framework. And I'm just going to find his presentation here. So can I give a warm welcome for Scott Duguid?
So good afternoon. Thank you for having me out here to the APPI conference. As the minister did, I want to just acknowledge being on Treaty 7 territory here. As she mentioned, the home of the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, Blackfoot, and Tsuut'ina, as well as the homeland of the Métis. So usually you'll see me twice up here talking. I don't nearly have as much energy or pizzazz as Judy, so I'll do my best not to be monotone. But anyways, the theme of the conference here about revitalization is an important one for us in land use planning, at least from the provincial point of view. And I'll explain a little bit why, but we're approaching 10 years now of having the Alberta Land Stewardship Act as well as the land use framework. I'm an acting executive director, so I'm not really in charge. I don't have the keys to the mansion yet, but hopefully, I can approach this 10 years as a way to maybe take a new look at the way we're doing regional planning in the province, take a look back at the lessons we've learned over the past 10 years, and approach in a similar way the idea of revitalization as one of the key things moving forward. So I will give this presentation and I'll talk through a little bit. I'm not too aware of where the knowledge level is in the room about regional planning, so I'll do my best to just provide the information about it. And then hopefully that'll inform your conversations at the table. And then I'll be back to talk about Indigenous involvement in regional planning, which is kind of more the focus of the past 10 years of my life, but certainly moving forward. So a bit about my background. As I mentioned, acting executive director of the Land Use Secretariat in Alberta, Government of Alberta. I've also worked for Indigenous Relations, Environment and Parks, different iterations of environment, but mostly working with Indigenous or Aboriginal communities across the province. Prior to that, I did some land use planning work in Northwest Territories. So different regulatory regime, a bit of a different socio-political area, working under co-management and settled land claims in the Northwest Territories. So it was a very different atmosphere in the way we approached planning there than sort of, how we do it here in Alberta. But it's a bit of my background, a bit of who I am. I do have a degree in geography and land use planning, so I certainly probably not nearly as qualified as some of the folks in this room, but I do have a little bit of education around planning and those types of things moving forward. So I will go ahead with my presentation. So we're, with land use planning, we talk about, and the minister talked a little bit about in her talk about revitalization, smart growth, those types of things. Those will be the underpinning for my conversation moving forward. But looking back to 2005, 2008, that time frame, Alberta was at a place being Albertans or whether people have experience from that time, being at a place in the province where we're starting to see substantial growth, substantial population growth. Certainly municipal planners and urban planners will have seen that or been working on those aspects in migration to the province, challenges to infrastructure, challenges to services in municipalities and in cities. At the province, certainly dealing with those types of things as well. The thought at the time was that we should embark on a regional planning or a land use planning initiative within the province. So we took these main sort of categories as the underpinning for our planning initiative moving forward. So we talked about strong communities, we talked about the need to manage outdoor recreation, biodiversity, clean air and water, a diversified economy, and a collaborative approach to planning as the underpinning for moving forward in development of regional planning. In 2008, I'll say we, Government of Alberta, built or engaged, and I'm assuming some of the folks that have been around in the room or through that time probably engaged on the development of the land use framework. That was very much seen as the roadmap or the development stages of what regional planning would become in the province. It set aside or set out a vision for the province. It built what we call the three pillars, and I'll talk a little bit about a fourth pillar. But at the time, the three pillars of regional planning, the idea of a balanced exercise between the economics, the environmental, and the social well-being of Albertans. In typical planning fashion, it was a vision followed by outcomes, followed by strategies. So, typical planning 101. But the idea for us was around our provincial outcomes were around a healthy economy, healthy ecosystems, and people-friendly communities. And the way we were going to achieve that vision and outcome was through the strategies. So the development of 7 regional plans, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and the minister mentioned that. The creation of the Land Use Secretariat, which I'm a part of. Cumulative effects management, which Kim will talk about. So cumulative effects to air, water, land, biodiversity. Conservation and stewardship. Talk a little bit about that moving forward. Certainly Chad will talk about that. Efficient use of land, and I know many municipalities and urban planners are dealing with that actively, the idea of efficient use of land. Continuous improvement, which is certainly the theme of this gathering, but also I think where I'm at as a leader within, at least with government on land use planning, and the involvement of Indigenous people or inclusion of Indigenous people in land use planning, and I'll talk a fair bit more about that. And that'll be a lot of sort of lessons learned. So I'll be pretty self-critical or critical of government, a little self-deprecating. But I think my point in doing that, though, is to shine a light on those types of issues that we dealt with, but then also talk about some of the road to improvement and some of the things that we're doing. So I'll be a bad civil servant, but it's in the right spirit. So we talked about the 7 planning regions, and I'll go through this quickly. Minister Phillips talked about the fact that the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan is in place in the northeast of the province. So number 1, the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan in the furthest south is in place. We're continuing to work on the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan. The idea was just to show you how the province is divided out. I'm sure most people are aware of that. It's divided out mostly by major watershed. The idea is to maintain ecological integrity within those discrete watersheds as a way to managing rivers, managing water flows, those types of things, is an easier exercise within a contained basin or a contained river sort of approach. Anyways, I won't dwell on this one, but it's just showing how the province is divided up into regions. We talk about building a 50-year vision or 50-year plan for each of these regions. So it's a balance of the here and now and conversations about managing pressures here and now, but also developing, as Minister Phillips mentioned, and I'm sure most people can at least grab onto, is this idea of building and planning for future generations. And I think when I talk about the Indigenous approach we've taken, it's really about, understanding from an Indigenous point of view how Indigenous thought and sort of traditional knowledge approaches 7 generations or a generational approach, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my next presentation. The Alberta Land Stewardship Act is the backstop legislation for regional planning in the province. So one of the criticisms of regional planning and the way planning was done in the province back to the 80s and 90s was, folks thought that it was a good effort. It was reasonable to go out and do planning, whether it was by integrated resource planning or sector-based planning. One of the major criticisms was that there wasn't enough teeth behind what the government, and I guess there's arguments to the other side, of course, too, but one of the main criticisms was that there wasn't enough teeth behind planning efforts in the province. It became more of a policy exercise. It was a best practices, nice to do, nice to know, provided some guidance for industry and for municipalities, but really didn't have the teeth again. So we talk about the Alberta Land Stewardship Act as being the enabling or the enacting legislation that places it as a piece of legislation at a bit of a paramount place amongst other pieces of legislation. So if you look at the Water Act or the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, or even the Municipal Government Act, ALSA, as a piece of legislation, is intended to sit above those. Regional plans are intended to guide those pieces of legislation, which is, I'll talk a little bit more as I go on, but why it's land use planning in the province isn't just, it's a regulatory exercise, but it's also a policy alignment exercise, and Kim will talk a little bit about that in how we approach the environment. But anyways, just to sort of put it into perspective, the Act sets the stage and the strength behind regional plans here in the province. This is a little bit of sort of, and I know it's a busy slide, and definitely I'll make sure that this is available for folks. Way too wordy, I get it, and I'm not gonna read to this, and hopefully I haven't been, but I'm not gonna read to this. But what I'm trying to show you in this is just sort of how regional plans are developed in the province, and I guess whether we call it due diligence, it's probably the systemic approach to how regional plans are developed in the province. So you look at the component parts of all of these to build a systems approach to how plans are developed. Certainly decision makers at the highest level, Minister Phillips and her colleagues at the cabinet level, will be providing the policy guidance down, but we'll also be receiving the regional plan or those policies on the way back up. The Land Use Secretariat and the government ministries of some who are represented here in the room are tasked with taking that sort of cabinet guidance and mandate from the government, taking a look at current policies, current regulations, developing a path forward through a regional plan, and then relying on the 2 feedback mechanisms at the bottom of this, or sort of internal feedback into the system, whether it's through stakeholders, partners, industry, Indigenous people, all Albertans, and then regional advisory councils, which are a legislated group, supposed to be a cross-section of folks from an area, from a region, business owners, ranchers, land users, municipal leaders, those types of folks sitting down in a room, in a structured process, developing a set of recommendations and guidance for government. That's all sort of thrown into the process. I just wanted to give you a sense of the deliberation that goes into the development of a regional plan and where that falls. Chad will talk a little bit about this in his presentation, but this is kind of what we call the planning hierarchy in the province. And just, I wanted to give you folks a sense of sort of, certainly where municipalities and municipal planning frameworks sit within, or hopefully sit within the planning hierarchy in the province, but also just a sense of the complexity, as Minister Phillips mentioned in her speech, just the idea of the complexity of planning, regulatory alignment, decision-making at an operational level, and where sort of the advice and guidance and how that trickles down. So the idea that, regional plans, again, are seen as 50-year visions or high level. So you'll see them in this hierarchy at a fairly high stage. I think ideally, and I don't think, and be critical of government here and now, I don't think we've done a great job of sub-regional planning. We've put out regional plans, we've put out the Lower Athabasca, we've put out the South Saskatchewan regional plan. We're working on the North Saskatchewan regional plan, but I would suggest that decision makers, whether they be municipal or whether they be within government, are really striving to understand, okay, it's great that you've put out this broad regional plan and it's this big geographic space and it's this 50-year vision and there's lots of sort of guidance, but sort of not guidance. And this isn't to be a bureaucrat and wishy-washy, but what I mean is, like, people at the operational level or at the municipal level are still begging to say, well, what does this regional plan mean to me? What does this mean to my day-to-day? How do I govern my decision-making on this? So again, a little self-critical, but I think that's the next step, and I think it's a missing step right now. I think, when we look at management plans, Kim's going to talk about that, and Chad will talk about that, and I think we're doing a decent job in getting that management planning done. It's the sub-regional level, I think, where we're missing a little bit. And again, wordy slide, I'm not going to talk through it too much, but other than to say, the what's in it, Judy talked a little bit about the what's in it, what does it mean for municipal planners, urban planners, folks in this room. We talk about the binding nature of regional plans, and we talk about compliance. We talk about the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. Again, I'll make sure this is available for folks, but it's the idea that not only the Crown, but local government bodies and decision makers, and we define who those decision makers are bound by regional plans. So I would say, I'll be open for questions, but you folks as planners, whether they be municipal, urban, those types of things, probably be asking, well, how do I become compliant with something, again, as I mentioned, where there's no sub-regional direction, there's this high-level regional type direction. So I feel empathy for you folks in the room who have to develop a sense of compliance to something, again, that's generally high-level and fairly nebulous. But anyways, that's how the legislation is set up, and there is an expectation that folks be compliant, and we talk about ensuring that municipal planning is compliant with the high-level objectives of a regional plan as we move forward, providing sort of that roadmap and evidence of alignment with the regional plan. So we can talk a little bit more, but that's kind of the dry part of my job. Another sort of slide to talk a little bit about sort of the approvals. So this one really just talks about, and it talks about who approves something, what the authority is, and what those plan types are. For the most part, again, it kind of gets to the minister's point about complexity, but it gets to the planning hierarchy piece of things. And you talk about sort of nesting of plans and the idea that, you're looking at sort of at the ground level, planning advice, at a director or designate level, operational plans, so very focused operations, through directors, through ministry legislation, and then moving up, you're getting into management plans, which Kim will talk about, and then sub-regional plans and regional plans. So I'm really trying to hit home about the hierarchy, but this just kind of gets to more of, the nesting and the layering and the hopefully intentional alignment of these levels of plans, again, with objectives and strategies at the highest level. Very much of the integration and the conversation that we have at the Secretariat and with our partner ministries is around integration and integration of both planning and policy. So Minister did talk a little bit about the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, and some of the folks in this room were part of that, and I certainly was part of the development of the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. At the time I was working with the Indigenous communities in the Northeast. So a big part of what I was working on was the consultation with the First Nations and Métis in the Lower Athabasca region. We talk about that being the first plan out the gate for us, and it was very much a conscious decision at the time to move forward on the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. There was a lot of pressure from, again, in-migration of people into the region. There was certainly industrial pressure from oil sands, SAGD, a lot of land use issues, fragmentation of landscapes. We were dealing with linear disturbance, as the minister mentioned, the idea of balancing environmental outcomes, understanding what the carrying capacity within the environment locally was for levels of industrial development, so using scenario development, how much, and certainly playing around with modeling and playing around with balance equations. If we went full steam ahead on the economic side of things, what would that mean for the environment? What would that mean socially? if we scaled way back and we were heavy into environmental protection, what would be the economic cost? So there was a lot of modeling, a lot of balancing, a lot of conversations with stakeholders in developing the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan as a bit of a blueprint for development in the region. It came out with a lot of plan to plans, and Kim will talk a little bit about that in her presentation, but the idea of management frameworks and finding triggers and limits for monitoring the environment and understanding where we're at as far as environmental balance goes. Now that plan is actually up, or was up, for its 5-year review, which we're actively working on. But one of the things that I'll mention, and it sort of segues into my presentation, and I'm almost done here, segues into my presentation on the Indigenous side of things, but there were 6 First Nations and 1 Métis group that challenged this. So there's a piece within the Alberta Land Stewardship Act where somebody, doesn't matter who, can challenge the regional plan from any aspect. So 6 First Nations and 1 Métis group chose to challenge the regional plan from the aspect that it detrimentally impacted their rights on the land. So within 1 year, they issued this challenge to the plan. We pulled together a panel to review that, and I'll talk again in my next talk about sort of what those recommendations were and how that became a lesson learned for us and how that shaped where we're moving with Indigenous people in the province. Talk about the Saskatchewan Regional Plan, and Chad will talk about the Livingston Porcupine work, but that was very much different landscape, certainly than the Lower Athabasca. Lower Athabasca was full of industrial development, was full of oil and gas, a whole bunch of green zone up there. We're dealing with forestry, vacant public land or occupied public land. In the south, very much dealing with private property, white zone, municipalities, the interaction amongst sort of the recreational users, what was seen as random land use, protection of native grasslands, very much a different set of issues, certainly, obviously geographically, and Chad will talk a little bit about that, but that was the second plan that came out in 2014, and we're approaching a 5-year cycle on that plan as well. The North Saskatchewan, as the minister mentioned, we're still working on moving forward. It's been a long process, so again, take your shots for sure, because it's taken almost a full mandate to get to the point where we've released the Regional Advisory Council recommendations in the spring of this year, and we've been deliberating on that, but it's still really, and she's not here anymore, but I mean, within this government's mandate, we haven't moved a regional plan out the door. And the minister talked about the importance of regional planning, and I truly believe that she believes that regional plans are important. I'm not saying that that's not the case. I think, though, as a new government, and whether I get fired or not, but as a new government, I think they came in thinking maybe that regional planning was a construct of the previous government, and that they came in and took a look at the complexity involved in developing a regional plan, and it's very much a tough integrated conversation. And I think this government had their priorities and the things that they wanted to achieve, and I think maybe regional planning looked like a tough thing to do, and they continue to want to work through it and want to continue to work with us. But again, it's hard. And she mentioned in the Livingston Porcupine that not everybody was happy, and I would say in developing a regional plan, it's a similar exercise where when you're balancing things that are so important to people's daily lives, and you're the sense of government trading off the environment, or trading off economy, or trading off social factors, is a scary prospect for stakeholders. And I think for government, that again added a complexity to it. So I'll just sort of leave it at that before I say too much more. Last slide, and all I wanted to show you is kind of on that complexity piece, and I know certainly for municipal planners and others, very much a complex landscape. But just with respect to the regional planning in the province, we're looking at a complex nature. This is sort of the systems approach to the system at large. So you see 5-year audits, 10-year reviews, all the way back to pre-planning, implementation. Just a sense of the stages, who's involved, and that idea again of constant improvement. And this system is meant to sort of show you how in the province we try to maintain that idea of around improvement. So that's the end. I know I've gone over. a couple of links for you to talk about planning, the planning hub, and hopefully, if you want, you can look things up, and I'll be back to talk about the Indigenous portion moving forward and answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. So, Kim, we're just going to wait 2 seconds. Sorry. So, sorry, I just need to find the deck that I was working with. So, at your tables, we will not have a large amount of time, just due to some of the delays that getting started. However, what I would like to do is at least give you 5, maybe 10 minutes to start a conversation at your table around a couple of key questions. And now, if you think of another question you think, as you've been listening to Scott and your mind has been trying to connect some dots around what your work is and what this regional and sub-regional land use framework planning is about, to sit and ask yourself some of the questions. Sorry, I guess it didn't go up onto the screen. So the question at your table is, what do you think are important aspects of the province's planning system to support long-term sustainability, regionally, sub-regionally, and local? So that's one question, and you see it on your long 11 by 17 sheet. The other bigger question, I think, is what role do professional planners need to play in this formative planning system? So Scott raised a number of points around, you know, there's things that we think we've been doing good. We've got that, you know, that basics to the system in place, but there's areas where we know we need to improve. What role do you think that you can play in helping to improve that process? And I'm going to throw it to you, and it's a big challenge to you, as what role do you think professional planners have in this system? So you can pick somebody at your table to write down your comments. I'll give you 5 minutes. Oh, that's the next presentation, but it's okay. Sorry, we're having time. But, you know, while we're doing this, that means that you guys can be talking, you know. Come on now. Don't just sit there and stare at me. So you've got 2 minutes to wrap up your conversation, and then we will be moving over to Kim's presentation. So we're going to set Kim up, and you can just wrap up your discussion. Hopefully, I could hear the tone in the room increasing, so I'm taking that as a good sign that you're actually getting a little bit more into the discussion, and or you're talking about what you're going to do when we get done. One of the two.
Thanks for putting them all together.
So you do have your speaking notes beside here.
Oh, okay. Well,
So all you have to do is just
I've got
use
this. So yeah.
that.
But this is my dilemma, though, right? Like I have distance glasses and reading glasses, and I'm just going to go without any at all because I can't, you know. Yeah, no, I can't. I won't be able to. Well, maybe I can. Oh, maybe I can.
Yeah. Well, see what works.
I've scribbled a lot on here, though, too.
Yeah.
I meant to update them, and I didn't have time.
Yeah.
That's really
All right.
good,
Thank you all very much. We're going to start the next presentation series. So we're going to start with Kim Lalonde, and she's going to be doing a presentation. So she's going to start to peel back some layers on some of that framework that Scott presented. And she's going to speak more about what's cumulative effects management in Alberta and how does it fit into this bigger planning system. And then we're going to immediately turn it over to Chad Wilms to talk more about sub-regional planning in the Livingston and Porcupine Hills area.
Great. Thanks very much, Judy. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you some of the work that we're doing related to cumulative effects management, and also to have an opportunity for you to have some discussion that we can learn from you as well, for sure. Just a tiny bit of background, as Scott has as well. I've had a lot of experience in the department. I've worked with environment and parks in various different forms of the department over the years as well. So lots of different experience in different parts of the department. And my current role is, as Judy would have said, Director of Regional Planning. So I have the pleasure of leading a team that works on regional planning. And just to kind of clarify that in terms of the department, we do regional planning on behalf of Alberta Environment and Parks that then feeds into that cross-government effort on regional planning more broadly that is cross-government and is led then by the Land Use Secretariat. So, as all of you will be aware as professional planners in the province, we have a complex mix of pressures and demands across our landscapes, and the need to manage across many values, needs, and uses, and also the need to be taking an integrated approach across environmental media, so doing our best to keep driving towards more integration across land, water, air, and biodiversity. So while our natural resources offer many opportunities for the economy and for people, the impacts of our human activities do create pressures and challenges on the landscape, as we all know. Industry, agriculture, forestry, land development, outdoor recreation, conservation, all important values, needs, and uses out there that can be competing for the same capacity and resources. So it leads, of course, to many challenges and opportunities for management, and we've done a bit of effort here to capture some of those challenges and opportunities on this slide. So managing growth from those competing land uses, managing for cumulative effects, planning for uncertainty, for example, climate change, ensuring sustainability of our land use for today and future generations, and incorporating Indigenous peoples' worldview and traditional and knowledge in land use planning. So for my presentation today, I'm going to focus on cumulative effects and cumulative effects management. And where I guess it doesn't really fit in very well perhaps to the revitalization theme because it is newer territory that we're charting. It is still part of that continuous improvement that Scott mentioned, looking continuously to improve our management systems across the province for environmental and resource management, land management, and so on. So we do have the land use framework to provide guidance for us in cumulative effects management. So government policy on cumulative effects management, the framework, as Scott mentioned, from 2008, and then the Alberta Land Stewardship Act as well. So there are 7 strategies in the land use framework, and one of those strategies is specifically about cumulative effects, stating that cumulative effects management will be used at the regional level to manage the impacts of development on land, water, and air. And this is the definition of cumulative effects as found in the land use framework: the combined effects of past, present, and reasonably foreseeable land use activities over time on the environment. So pretty straightforward definition, I think. And really, when we talk about management of cumulative effects, it's a recognition then of the finite capacity of our airsheds, watersheds, and landscapes across the province. So Alberta Environment and Parks, working with other ministries, is continuing to work to advance cumulative effects management. I made reference to the fact that we're one department in the government. We do work on a collaborative basis across government, and we are doing a lot of work to advance the whole concept and principles of cumulative effects. And these are some of the underlying principles here on this slide. To start off with, it's outcomes-based, so we're working towards desired outcomes across environmental, economic and social considerations, so looking across all 3 of those, and looking forward into Indigenous peoples' values and worldview as well. Place-based, different regions can have different needs and so on. We have really diverse landscapes, as you all know, again, across the province. And the choice was made to look on a regional basis using watersheds and municipalities as the guides for delineating the regions. But of course, we can have significant differences across regions. So place-based, knowledge-based, foundation of adaptive management approach, and recognizing shared stewardship. Excuse me. But of course, we have to move from those principles to developing and implementing actual approaches to get us to better management of cumulative effects. So this slide shares with you a little bit about the overall vision for implementing cumulative effects management. So the first aspect is to establish cumulative effects regional environmental thresholds for air, water, and biodiversity that help us achieve our desired outcomes. Then the second is to link those cumulative effects-based environmental thresholds to planning and decision-making processes. And then the third, to develop and implement a support system of information gathering and analytical tools. So looking at that first aspect of establishing cumulative effects-based regional environmental thresholds for air, land, water, and biodiversity, a key approach that the Government of Alberta has been doing is the development of environmental management frameworks for regions as part of regional planning. And I'll just pause there to say, this is the language that we've adopted for this tool, this approach that we're using, environmental management frameworks. There's no secret around it. It gets to be a bit jargony and it's sort of part of our lingo now, but there's really no magic to it. It's intended to be frameworks that we have set out so we can be managing within that framework. And that's just the language that we've chosen along the way. So a key approach is environmental management frameworks to help us get to that vision of managing our cumulative effects. And basically they're developed and then implemented as policy documents that are given legal authority as specified in the regional plans. So the regional plans are really important for us to make that move from policy, which is really important for guidance in the system, but also to have authority as needed to set up the thresholds and requirements for action and so on. And sometimes people think that this is just more numbers and more standards and objectives that have to be met, but we really do see this as building on the existing Government of Alberta policies, legislation, and regulations, and providing that long-term piece for the cumulative aspects, and looking at both that management in the long term for existing activities and future development. So they are essentially intended to set up a performance management system to proactively manage cumulative effects, to try and get ahead of those cumulative effects, and also to provide means to adapt over time as we need to adapt and make sure we are addressing cumulative effects. So the core suite that the Government of Alberta has been working on to date is a suite of frameworks for surface water quality, groundwater, air quality, and biodiversity. And the slide shows some of the documents. Those are available on Alberta Environment and Parks sites. That's a flash to the past, to Environment and Park sites and Land Use Secretariat sites as well. So I apologize for people who've heard many of our presentations before on frameworks. I'm just going to give a little bit more information on frameworks as a whole, share a little bit more. So bear with me for those of you who may have heard this before. The starting point for the environmental management frameworks is the regional outcomes and objectives. So we work through regional planning and development of the frameworks to identify what we see as being regional outcomes and objectives. And when we have those in place, then really what we're doing next is looking for some indicators that can help us then determine whether we're meeting those objectives for the region. So that will resonate with all of you, again, as planners for sure. So, either a solid indicator or a suite of indicators that really help us to know where we're going. And then we work to establish the thresholds around those indicators. So in thresholds, we use, again, I'll just, take a minute to talk about, the word thresholds. It's got a lot of different meanings to different people and so on, so it's a bit of a challenge. But we use it a little bit generically to talk about the kinds of numbers that we're trying to determine through environmental management frameworks. So talk about triggers in a system, so conditions that, setting conditions at a certain trigger level, limits, and possibly targets as well. So we've got the indicators, and we're actually looking for some markers in the system, some points in the system, some numbers that tell us we're either at a trigger point or a limit point, and we can over time also look at developing targets. So once we have indicators and those threshold numbers, then the frameworks describe the monitoring system that is going to be used to see how we're doing with respect to those indicators. So the monitoring helps us understand where we are with conditions and inform decision makers and planners. And then the last component is if we do exceed a trigger or a limit value, then the frameworks describe a management response process that we then follow to address what we're seeing in conditions of the environment. And then that whole process of looking at management responses can look at regulatory sides of things, the regulation side of things, and different requirements for the regulatory system, and also look at non-regulatory aspects as well. So voluntary best management practices, research, more monitoring programs, more specific monitoring, development of more detailed plans, operational plans. An example would be like the Bow River Phosphorus Plan, that kind of more specific plan. Oops. Sorry, just getting my notes set up here. Sorry, I think I went past one. Okay. Right. So the system does have, whoops, oh boy. Okay. See if it stays this time. The system has an annual monitoring, evaluation, and reporting cycle, as shown here. So just as described, as I was speaking about, up in the upper left-hand corner, we have ambient monitoring. So we do our monitoring to see where we are with conditions in the system. And then we, no, is this going, yeah, it's all the way up there. We assess then where we are against those triggers and limits that we've set in the system. And we assign levels to say, okay, this is where we're sitting with those conditions. If we do need to undertake a management response, it cycles around onto that lower left-hand side to the management response point. And then I'll just point out that there is that arrow coming down, though, off of the out of the cycle as well, talking about informing decision making. So this takes us to the other aspects of the vision for the system that I spoke to earlier. So those other 2 points were to linking those cumulative effects, environmental thresholds, to planning and decision making, and to develop and implement a support system for information gathering and analytical tools to support that overall effort as well. The EMFs really are intended to inform decision-making and planning, and especially at the provincial government level to inform the integrated resource management system. So what is the integrated resource management system? It really is a foundation in the province for achieving responsible resource development. And it basically includes a network of departments, ministries, and agencies in the provincial government, including agriculture and forestry, energy, environment and parks, Indigenous relations, and the Alberta Energy Regulator as the core members of that integrated resource management system. And then there are other departments as well, such as culture and tourism, municipal affairs, and so on, transportation, and those departments as well participate on files that affect their mandate and so on. So we've got this effort across ministry again to integrate across government for all of our planning and decision making. So you'll see in the guide, plan, do, and check cycle, the regional plans, including policy guidance and other direction, such as the direction from the frameworks, are used by RMS partners. So we're feeding into that plan, guide, plan, do, and check cycle. So what does that mean for environmental management frameworks in terms of feeding into the IRMS system? Well, for environmental management frameworks, this means that IRMS members, Integrated Resource Management System members, consider the status with respect to the triggers. So where are the conditions of the environment? Where have we found things to be? Where are we in relation to triggers we've established in their decision making on approvals? So as development comes forward in the province, they're looking at where we are and how much more capacity basically there is in the system and using that in their decision making. They also participate on an ongoing basis in the management approaches being used by government. So we've always got regulatory and different programs and services going on, and they're participating in those. And then if a management response does need to be initiated, so if we should cross a trigger, we're starting to see change in the environment that is more than we want to see, or is just we need to understand better why it's happening, then they participate in that management response process. And so then they work collaboratively across government with Environment and Parks on determining what actions are needed. And that can mean adjusting existing actions, right? A lot of the times it just means adjusting, tweaking, renewing existing things, but it can mean some new actions. We might say, no, we really do need to take a different approach here and build what that action should be. So I guess I'd like to say that I think that's similar for local governments as well in a region. I think that we consider that environmental frameworks can be providing information on this with respect to the status of environmental conditions and so on, where we are with respect to those triggers, that can help inform planning and decision-making at that local level as well. And local governments, of course, can be making important contributions to that management, the management that's in place already that I was referring to. You know, we've got government departments working on management across, on various initiatives and regulatory requirements and so on. And there can be important contributions that local governments are making too, of course, as well. And the intention would be definitely to be involving local governments in the collaborative approach if we do undertake any management responses, so that we have that local knowledge, that local involvement and so on, so that there's that involvement in that process as well. So the third point is, woo, gee whiz, this really does have a life of its own. Okay. Oh, whoa. Oh, boy. Maybe I'll just try and go back there because I don't really need the fancy popping up thing anyway. Okay, so this takes me to the third point, and that is the decision support tools. So we really do need to be continuing to work on our decision support tools. It's a critical part of the system here going forward. I think we've made some really significant progress in getting frameworks and what the frameworks, the concept should be, in getting indicators and thresholds built and so on, and we're really trying to advance continuing to work here on decision support tools. You know, in order to implement the frameworks, there can be ongoing efforts in those development support tools and in that decision making. So it's an example here. I just threw up an example of showing a little part of the region and the land footprint that we already see in a region. And as we have new footprint coming onto a region, we can be having project applications coming through, for example, to Environment and Parks. We could have different kinds of requirements that have to be looked at by Agriculture and Forestry, and then similarly by the AER. So what we really need is tools that can provide coordinated, common information and can help with the analysis of possible scenarios and options. So everyone can have access to that information. How are we, you know, again, what are the conditions, but also what is happening in terms of other aspects of environmental management and so on? What are the other programs out there? What other considerations do we need to look at? What are the economic and social considerations that we need to look at? How do we get all of that information into the decision-making system? And then looking at some of the tools and modeling and so on that we can be using for analysis and options. So this work on decision support tools is actively moving ahead and is continuing, and we're working on management of cumulative effects more broadly. So I guess a couple of questions going forward in my mind are, you know, what are other approaches we're using or can or should be using to achieve cumulative effects management? So, you know, we've got environmental frameworks we've spent a lot of time and effort on, continuing to do that, but there's other things that we're going to be needing as a system to really fully address cumulative effects management. We think there's lots of other things out there that we should be tapping into and can be tapping into. So what other approaches are we using and can we be using? And how can we also continue to work towards that integration across the air, land, water, and biodiversity? How can we keep driving that integration? So it's complex work and a complex environment, and it requires the work and expertise of many professionals. So I appreciate having the chance to chat with you today, and look forward to hearing some of your deliberations after. Thanks very much. Oh, there, got my phones.
Thanks, Kim. I'm just going to work real fast here and get Chad's presentation up. All right. So we're running into some time delays, so we're probably not going to bounce to the questions after this one. We're going to probably just go right into Scott's final presentation on Indigenous involvement. So.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks everybody for having me here today. So I'm going to be presenting on a couple of the sub-regional plans that we've developed under the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. So I wasn't actually involved in this position right now. I'm the Director of Land and Environmental Planning South when these plans were developed and approved. There's some other people that would, I'm sure, be way better suited to present on this than I am. However, I'm in the position today, and it's actually my birthday today. So this is sort of my present in that they allowed me to present to you today. So thanks for having me here. So again, Scott presented this, but I'm going to quickly go over again the planning hierarchy. So at the top, we have provincial policy and legislation. So in this planning context, we have the land use framework, which is a provincial strategic policy, which is supported by the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. Underneath that, we have regional plans and environmental management frameworks, and the context that I'm presenting on is the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. A reminder, Scott went over this, the planning regions are based on watersheds, not provinces, so we're still talking about Alberta here, not southern Saskatchewan, but rather the South Saskatchewan River Basin. So the part of the province that we're looking at is essentially Calgary and south. So the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan provides a high-level vision for the region and some outcomes, and provides direction to the management of public lands, including management of land disturbance, and it points to the need for developing a land footprint management plan. So that occurs then at that sub-regional planning level. Underneath the sub-regional planning then, we have recreation management planning, also an outcome of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. It uses the direction provided at that sub-regional level and applies it more at that operational level. So full disclosure, I'm not a professional planner. I'm actually a biologist by background. There's definitely planners on the team. But the planning team has a combination of professional planners, ecologists, biologists, foresters, and other specialists. I for sure can't, tell you detail about the planning process or the planning theory that goes into this planning process. Rather, I'm going to go over, some of the details that are within these plans to try to give you some context as to what these plans are trying to do. Some of the outcomes they're trying to achieve on the landscape, and hopefully you can take that away and think about how that links into the planning that you do, whether that's at the provincial level or the municipal level or within other planning that you do. So the Livingston and Porcupine Hills areas are shown here in yellow and gray. So this is the far southwestern corner of Alberta. Calgary is the gray blob on the left map there, that large urban area. So we're looking south of Calgary and west of Lethbridge. Lethbridge isn't actually shown on the map there, but we're tucked right up into the eastern slopes on the edge of the Rocky Mountains. And the right map there shows a blow-up of the planning area. The yellow planning unit, there's the Livingston, and the gray next to it, that smaller area, is the Porcupine Hills. So the Livingston and Porcupine Hills combined with the Castle Parks, which were newly created this past year, form a really key landscape in the province. It's part of the larger internationally recognized Crown of the Continent ecosystem. This area has long been recognized by Indigenous peoples, scientists, and conservation organizations as having a high value. It has big scenery. It's really known for its iconic viewscapes. It has a lot of really key wildlife and biodiversity values, high watershed values. This forms headwaters to the Old Man Basin. But it's also heavily used because of how amazing it is. It's heavily used by recreationalists, both motorized and non-motorized recreationalists. It's regularly used by hunters, anglers, equestrian users, campers, but there's also a lot of industrial activity. There's commercial forestry out there, there's oil and gas activity, there's mining activity. So it's a really busy landscape, which is why it was pointed to by the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan as needing to have a management system put in place to continue to enable all of these activities, these land use activities, but in a more pre-planned and managed way. So human activities and land use activities support both social and economic values and goals. However, they can both have direct and indirect impacts on environmental values, including on water quality, air quality, wildlife habitat, wildlife mortality directly, and overall impacts to biodiversity. Research and monitoring have shown that managing human footprint includes the extent, duration, and rate of disturbance, and the associated motorized access that uses that footprint are the most significant actions we can take to support biodiversity and watershed health. So there's two key components that we're trying to manage for within the land footprint or the human footprint management plan. The first is to manage motorized access into the area and set density thresholds for linear disturbance. So motorized use within the area primarily occurs where there's already access cut in by industry, whether that's haul roads for supporting the forest industry, or roads leading to well sites, or pipelines, or seismic lines. When you take in a motorized vehicle, they're typically following a path or a clearing that's being cut for industrial purposes. So if we can manage for industrial access and the creation and then also subsequent closure of those access roads, of those disturbances, we're then also managing for motorized access onto the landscape. Second key component is spatial human footprint. So this is then to manage the overall footprint from human disturbance within the planning area. So this is looking at all disturbances, including clear cuts, well pads, pipelines, seismic lines, roads, just overall footprint on the landscape. So we're still working on this component. This is actually way more complicated and complex than one might expect. But we are working on establishing targets for managing spatial footprint within the Livingston and Porcupine to set desirable future conditions based on both ecosystem needs for supporting biodiversity and watershed health, but also to support social and economic values. So to build a footprint plan, there's actually quite a long, this is a very simplified view as to how we go about setting the targets and thresholds to determine appropriate footprint. But essentially what we do is we take a whole bunch of information, a bunch of data layers on species at risk, on watershed values, biodiversity values, and we put them into a model to look at how to optimize and how to find out where those biodiversity and watershed hotspots are on the landscape and determine appropriate thresholds for them. So the thresholds for motorized activities were then based on the tolerances of some of the key wildlife species. The outputs that came out of that model were then reviewed and tested with fish and wildlife biologists, with hydrologists, with professional foresters, land specialists, and other experts. This work then was further tested and engaged upon both within government, cross-government ministries, but then also externally, out to industry, out to stakeholder organizations, to Indigenous communities. And so we took that feedback and put that back into the development of the draft footprint plan. And then once the draft footprint plan was completed, we again took that out for further engagement and consultation. So at the end then, we did end up with a land footprint plan. This then is a sub-regional plan under the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. As the minister mentioned over the lunch hour, this actually was a pretty big deal to be able to get this plan put in place. It is supported by legislation, by the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. So the thresholds that we have in here are actually enforceable. They have become regulation. And this is really unique. We are As far as our jurisdictional scan has found, the only jurisdiction within North America to have regulatory limits placed on linear footprint. So with that, then, we can manage for industrial access, but also motorized access for recreational use. As part of this planning process, though, under the regional plan, we're trying to manage for the entire landscape. We're not just trying to look at these two planning units in isolation, but looking at the connection of them with adjacent lands. So within this map, you can see the green areas. These are existing conservation and protected areas. To the south there, you have the Castle Parks. To the east, or in between the Livingston and the Porcupine, we have the Pecusco Heritage Rangeland. So they're recognized as being part of that Zone 1 within our plan, just recognizing that there's other planning processes and different management intents on the landscape. Zone 2 then is the darker gray area within the Livingston and Porcupine. This prioritizes high-valued landscapes while allowing some economic and social opportunities that have lower intensity disturbance types. Zone 3 is the light gray within those two planning areas. This enables a broad range of economic and social opportunities with an emphasis on reclamation and managing new footprint disturbances. So the plan uses motorized access densities as a measure to manage use and disturbance limit. So what we're looking at is both, not only looking at both biodiversity values, which is what's led to Zone 1 and Zone 2, and different thresholds on how much linear density we're willing to accept on the landscape, but also how much use that linear disturbance is actually receiving. So we have restricted motorized access, which is direction for industrial access. So these are haul roads and energy roads. They're typically gated. They're closed off to the public for recreational purposes, and therefore they see a lower density or lower volume of traffic on these roads, and therefore have an associated lower disturbance level for wildlife. So we have allowed a higher density of roads to support industrial access in both Zone 2 and 3. We also, though, have thresholds for open motorized access. So these are roads and trails, like part of the designated trail system that allows for public access. So this is where you can go out with your quads or trucks or motorbikes and still use the trail system and road system. A lot higher use. This is a very heavily used part of the province. A lot of people from across the province, but particularly southern Alberta, head out to the Livingston and Porcupine Hills on weekends, and the volume of traffic within the designated trails is a lot higher. Therefore, we do have two different thresholds within Zone 2 and Zone 3, just to recognize the amount of use that those roads and trails do get. So the thresholds on open motorized access is the direction and foundation for the development of the Recreation Management Plan. Again, we're now the first jurisdiction that we know of in North America to have this kind of a regulated system that enforces the development of recreation management planning. There's many other jurisdictions across North America that have recreation management planning processes in place. We're a little bit behind on management of recreation, but we're the first now to be able to have that regulatory backstop to support it. So the Recreation Management Plan then has the same planning units for the Livingston and the Porcupine Hills. Recreation planning at its core reflects the creation and management of experiences that people value. So we're looking at supporting still the users and experience within these areas. We're looking to have a designated trail system that still provides the people that are going out there with a great opportunity for using the area, for seeing the area, for doing the activities that they're interested in. But, in the public lands context, there's a lot of other land uses that I've gone over, and we're trying to then also manage for a lot of other values within this area, including biodiversity, watershed values, indigenous perspectives and values, managing for species at risk out there, considering neighboring landowners and land uses, tourism, economic impacts, industrial uses, scenic values, and many others. So we're trying to look at this complex landscape and all the different uses and values on the landscape and trying to then develop a recreation plan that supports all of them. The landscape was again assessed and analyzed for biodiversity and watershed hotspots, similar to what we did for the footprint plan, but now we're looking at where these hotspots are to take the thresholds that we have for linear footprint, but then trying to figure out where could we actually align the specific roads and trails across the landscape to minimize disturbance to some of the hotspots and better align them to support both scenic values, the user experience, but away from the more sensitive areas on the landscape. Pardon? I can't shoot, it's my birthday. I'm allowed to be up here as long as I want. I will try to be a little bit quicker. Okay, so the economic values on the landscape were also considered within the planning process. There are a lot of costs to industry and agriculture from random recreational use. As the minister also alluded to, I mean, energy companies suffer from infrastructure damage from non-regulated motorized use. Pipelines get eroded out, well sites get damaged, and it comes at a pretty significant cost to industry. Also, grazing leaseholders are losing valued grasslands that they need for supporting cattle. But there's also economic benefits from recreation on the landscape. It's a huge industry within the province, in excess of $5 billion province-wide. But then there's also other benefits, including improved community attractiveness for investment. We also look at the social values on the landscape. Within government, we have various tools that have been developed primarily by culture and tourism to be able to measure and look at both the recreation and tourism opportunities on the landscape. And this is a series of mapping products that we can use to look for the greatest opportunities. We also look at current use and demand by the actual people that are going out on the landscape. So we have surveys that we can use, including mobile surveys, to be out on the land and to find out from people that are going out there to recreate, where are they going, why are they going out there, what do they value on the landscape there, as well as through our stakeholder and consultation process. There's other social effects that we're looking to manage for, which includes noise, which is an issue for some of the local landowners. We're looking to support landowner rights out there, helping to support building communities, and also supporting Indigenous values. This is a really key one for us also. Supporting Indigenous values, I've found previously when I've been working at the regional planning level, so one step up, I help support development of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. I've found it really difficult to tie Indigenous values specifically to that regional planning process due to scale. I've found now, working at the sub-regional scale, this is the first time that I've been able to really, be able to better tie Indigenous values and traditional land uses to the planning process. The scale has come down, so now when we're out talking to communities and they're talking about specific hunting grounds of value to them, berry patches, cultural sites, historical sites, we can actually both be looking at the same map, and they can be pointing at a map at significant sites to them, and we can actually use that information now to support the planning process. So it's of great benefit to us, but I think Indigenous communities are really starting to see the value of planning at the sub-regional scale also. The recreation plan then also has high-level vision and objectives for the planning area, and from that then we've developed management direction. Quickly, just to go through these, this is just a few of them. It does direct motorized activity away from sensitive areas. It moves motorized camping from unmanaged random use to more managed use. We're phasing this in. These first two ones really are what are affecting the people going out into the Livingston and Porcupine and affecting how they use that landscape. So we're not just trying to create a plan and a regulatory system, but we're actually needing to also create a culture shift in the people that are going out there. They've been going out onto this landscape for, literally a generation into an largely unmanaged landscape and recreating freely. So it's taking a lot of education right now and a big shift in culture to try to get people to understand that, first of all, there's a planning process in place now, or there's a plan in place, but then also trying to understand why we're doing this and how it affects them. We're also trying to build better collaboration with all users and for sure recognizing First Nations use and values of the area. So to enforce the Recreation Management Plan, we've established a public land use zone. This is enabled under the Public Land Act or the Public Lands Administration Regulation. So this is a tool that we have available to us, which we now have in place to allow us to create a designated trail system and be able to enforce it. Recreation management planning process follows the 5 E's, which is engineering, enforcement, education, experience, and evaluation. We're not using all of them at the same level of intensity or the same level of focus. This first year right now, since the plan was approved in May of 2018, we're really focused on engineering and education. Now that we have a designated trail system in place, there's a lot of engineering that we need to do to ensure the trails are built and maintained properly, bridges are put in place, to have bridges to support vehicles crossing creeks and rivers. But then education is being used instead of enforcement this first year. Given that it's the first year that the plan's in place, we're not going out and ticketing everybody for driving on trails that they've been driving on for decades, but rather we're using an education approach this first year to ensure there's awareness of the plan that's in place. So ultimately, the creation of a recreation management plan and designation of the PLUs allows for an enforceable designated trail system. This is a snapshot from the north end of the Livingston. So the PLUs map, as it's called now, is available online. We have it available at all of our regional offices. We have downloadable and geo-referenced versions so that people that are going out there can take this map with them and know then where the trails actually are. There's different trails for different vehicle types. We have some designated trails for 4x4s, some for ATVs, some for motorbikes only. But this map then is a living document. Now that it's in place, it's not that it's going to remain static. We need to make updates to it to accommodate changing environmental conditions out there, but also changes in desired access and use across the landscape. So we're going to continue to work with stakeholders and user groups and Indigenous communities to ensure that as this map gets updated annually and ongoing, we're aligning trails to best support all the different uses within the area. So I think I'll leave it at that. Judy, thank you very much.
Thank you all for sticking around. If you can beg with me another 5 minutes, Scott will give you some highlights out of his presentation. We did start a little bit late, so that's part of our challenge here. And of course, as a good planner, I'm always trying to accomplish way more than I really can in the time that I have. So, but we'll still keep going, right? Here we go. Sorry. Okay, Scott.
So I'm back. I guess at my own peril, I talked too long at first, so I'm left myself the presentation that I like doing most and that's actually most near and dear. I've left myself with no time, but poor planning, my own fault. Hopefully, Glynis and Bill's presentation will have provided you at least some ideas about the importance of relationships and working with Indigenous communities and some practical, tactical options for that. I'll provide a little bit of high-level overview of sort of the evolution of the province's interaction with Indigenous people, some of the policies and some of the things behind where we're at working with Indigenous people, and I'll try to do that all in 5 minutes as quick as I can. So I mentioned in my first presentation about the idea of the development of the land use framework and where we were at then. At the time, First Nations and Métis organizations pushed the government to say, we really like the idea of 3 pillars that you're going to build the land use plans in the province on. We really like the economics and the social and the environmental. But the question from them was, where do we as Indigenous people, rights holders, whether they be treaty rights or Aboriginal rights, where do we fit in? And I'm using we as them. The question to us was, where do we fit in? Where do our rights fit into your contemplation, and our land use and our traditional uses fit into your contemplation of trade-offs and building regional plans into the future? The question was, well, it's not really, it is tied to an environmental consideration for certain. If you're talking about hunting and fishing and trapping, and traditional uses is definitely a clean environment and an abundance of wildlife, and those things are integral to it, but it's not really that. And then if you look at the social pillar, to a degree, if you're dealing with Indigenous culture and you're dealing with ceremony and you're dealing with an ability to practice on the land and in a manner in which Indigenous people expect to practice, or which is enshrined by the Constitution, doesn't really totally fit within the social pillar. And then with economics, certainly you would talk to Indigenous communities who want to be involved in the economy and who want to have a place at the table with respect to resource development and resource development decisions. But certainly they didn't see themselves in that. So, again, they pushed back a long time ago to be included, and the inclusion of a 4th pillar wasn't accepted back then. Sort of moving forward, several things with the new government coming in. The acceptance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is foundational. Truth and reconciliation, the calls to action being certainly foundational for the government moving forward. The desire by the government to have a new relationship with Indigenous people. We're very much behind a reconsideration of the development of a 4th pillar for regional planning, or a 4th outcome, a real driver. So for me, back to the lessons learned, when we did the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, we dealt with 21, we met with 21 First Nations and 8 Métis organizations, and our measurement of success back then was how many meetings did we have with those First Nations and Métis organizations, and we would run around and tout that we had 107 meetings, and that was somehow meaningful, and that was somehow a job well done, because we'd met 107 times. How could you not? And First Nations and Métis pointed back to us and said, well, many of those meetings were held where you presented us with high-level technical documents. You gave us a bunch of information about a system that we weren't even aware of, and said, oh, by the way, you have 30 days to comment on this. Tell us what you think, and we'll be back in 30 days. So, clearly there was a disconnect, I would suggest, in how we were consulting, the way we were dealing honorably with First Nations, I would say, and with Indigenous communities at the time. And so, as a result, I mentioned in 2012, Lower Athabasca Regional Plan came out. Within that year, we were challenged by 6 First Nations and 1 Métis organization who said, you didn't do a good job of consulting. You really didn't meaningfully involve us in the development of a regional plan. It's others of the criticisms that we heard from First Nations and Métis groups where we don't see ourselves in the plan. We see industry. We certainly see rules and regulations around industry. We see your vision for industry. We see your vision for the economy. We certainly see your vision for the environment, and we understand how you're going to balance the environment using management frameworks, as Kim said. But as sort of unique, constitutionally protected people within the region, they didn't see themselves. And they also, we talked a lot about, the criticisms at the time were, you've made a whole bunch of trade-off decisions, which are clear because you came out in phase 1 of consultation and you consulted. And then you came back to us in phase 2, and things had changed in your draft regional plan. And then you came out in phase 3, and there were more changes in the regional plan. So you've come out and you've incrementally changed the plan based on input from stakeholders in the public and assuming First Nations and Métis groups. But the big criticism from Indigenous groups was, why or why not? How did you use our information? How did you factor in treaty rights and traditional uses to trade-off discussions? You know, and a downright accusation or sort of finger-pointing from them to say, how dare you trade off a constitutionally, Section 35 constitutionally protected right, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, I mean, I'm an Albertan and I'm a white guy or, you know, a non-Indigenous person, but how dare you trade off, again, a constitutionally protected right for, you know, and then we got into these really deep rights, you know, the rights of Albertans versus rights of Indigenous people, and it's a messy, messy conversation, but, you know, the accusation was, you know, why and how? So a lot of that sort of came to a head in 2014-15. New government came in, as I mentioned, and I'll go as quick as I can. The view for moving forward on development of a fourth pillar, you know, sort of looks like this. We kind of went away from the pillar structure to a more Indigenous worldview. The idea of a circle, the idea of, you know, healing circle, medicine wheel, the idea of continuous improvement. I mean, that's a purposeful, and we have other diagrams, and I don't know if Glenys in her presentation talked about sort of, okay, good. So Glenys talked about sort of the idea of our approach towards working with Indigenous communities, but I did talk a little bit about the constitutionally protected rights. I certainly talked about that. We do, again, so I talked about our approach previously being sort of this idea of documents across the table, again, a feeling by Indigenous communities where there was a lack of capacity to participate, moving towards an ongoing collaborative sort of, and Glenys would have talked about it, but this idea of we're not just out to consult on regional plans because we have deadlines and we have to, you know, to get a product out, or we have to get a product to cabinet, or those types of things. It's more or less developing a relationship with groups of First Nations and Métis that are interested in a regional plan, are interested in a region, and want to be part of that region. And it's engaging early. It's about providing capacity early. So, I mean, I've been working personally with the North Peace Tribal Council. So up in the north, I've been working with them in advance of a plan that may or may not come, but I've been working with them for the past 4.5 years just to try to build capacity and understanding so that when it comes time to build a regional plan with those First Nations in the Northwest, that we can sit down on hopefully an equal playing field, and they understand what a biodiversity management framework is, but they also understand the tie between their land use patterns, their need for, for sustenance, and their need for hunting, fishing, and trapping, and how does that translate into our Western scientific view of biodiversity? How does their use on the river, whether it be for navigation, for hunting and fishing and trapping, or fishing, or those types of things, how does that translate into a water quantity management framework that Kim talked about? So how can I prepare, as a civil servant, how can I prepare those communities to be able to hit the ground running and actively participate in a regional planning where they can provide meaningful input that they feel is truly protecting their community's ability to practice on the land, practice a way of life, and protect, again, for the future generations, and Glenys may have talked about it, but certainly the intergenerational approach of Indigenous people and the idea of the duty of elders to pass on information to the youth, but the duty of elders also to leave a better place for those youth to come. Very much behind an Indigenous worldview and an Indigenous view of the world. So how do I help, as a civil servant, prepare those communities to be able to feel that they meaningfully participated? So it's about time, it's about relationship building. Again, it's about providing technical capacity at a pace and scale that's meaningful to an Indigenous community, as opposed to, here you go, here's a highly technical document, you have 30 days, and it's all about 53 constituents of a water quality management framework from selenium to, and the conversation gets lost, and we're talking like this. I'm out there talking about chemical constituents in the water, and they're talking about, can I still dip my cup in the river and drink when I'm out on the trap line? Do you know what I mean? And we never had that conversation to be able to answer some of those key questions for Indigenous communities So there was, again, a real disconnect. So it's trying to find that common ground and that place to connect and that place to find those sweet spots or those places to have those conversations. One thing, and this is a bit of a technical piece, but just for your awareness, and Jeremy's in the room from Municipal Affairs here, I think. Yeah, oh, there he is. Just one of the things, two changes to the Municipal Governance Act. Just one, that municipalities must notify neighboring Indigenous communities of new MDPs or area structure plans, and that legislation is clear that municipalities and Indigenous communities can collaborate. And you'll have seen one of the awards today was for Lethbridge, the city of Lethbridge, and actually where their relationship began with those First Nations. Obviously, they're neighbors, but structurally, from a relationship point of view, where that began was actually at one of our, and I don't say it's mine, it's our regional planning tables that Glynis leads. I mean, that relationship started. So, slide previously, I list some of the ongoing relationship tables that we have with First Nations and Métis across the province, and definitely working towards some of those others. So those of you in municipalities within those regions, I would definitely encourage you, if you want to start building, and I'm not suggesting that you don't necessarily have good relationships with your Indigenous neighbors, I'm assuming that you do, but this is just another forum potentially for those of you in municipalities to start, come around, start building those relationships. Sometimes, and again, this isn't, I've been self-deprecating, so this isn't to accuse folks in the room of anything, but, I hear from Indigenous groups that, the municipality doesn't understand us, or, they're not considering us in their land use planning or their decision making, and whether that's true or not, I'm not here to judge that, but I just, I hear that. I certainly hear enough mud slung at me too, so I offer those places as maybe, again, places to develop a relationship, be part of, even if it's just to come and listen to the interaction between government and Indigenous communities about planning or about, Indigenous worldview or how Indigenous people see themselves in planning. It's a good place to start building that. I talked about municipal governance, that's about it. So I know I didn't have much time, and I said I would take 5 minutes, and I took more than that. So I apologize in between you and a break. But if you have more questions about that, that's actually the part of my job, again, that it keeps me coming back to work every day. And it's part of what I'm really passionate about. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'm really glad that you stayed to listen to Scott. Yeah, as you can tell, he's got a lot of wisdom, and if you haven't read his bio, maybe I'll just let you know that Scott has actually been named an honorary elder by the Alexis Nakota Sioux First Nations. Scott has some very, very strong relationships with the Indigenous people in this province, and so he's also a very good resource for you to get some insight on how you might be able to start building those relationships. And I think he's put out an offer that maybe there's some opportunity to come and join him maybe at one of his tables so that you can get a little insight from them. So thank you again, Scott, Chad, and Kim, for your presentations. I do hope that they've provided you with a wealth of information to just start you thinking about this planning system in Alberta, and also to try and start that thought about what role do you play in that? What role do you need to play? And if I can say the one word that we've heard today is revitalize, the most important part of that word is vital. I think you guys are vital to ensuring that this regional planning and this land stewardship plan, land use framework planning system in which you're all a part of is improved over time and over space. And so I hope that you make room for some discussions and you continue to have those discussions. Please record them. Find me later, email me, whatever it is that you think you can try to contact me. And I'm always willing to have a conversation about where things are going and where we can help you get more information to help you build your knowledge and awareness. So thank you very much for your time.
And on behalf of the APPI Council and Conference Chairs, thank you all for giving your time. And if anybody wants these people's emails, you can come to me and I'll give them to you too.